You're fired, Dr. Ellison, and frankly, it's overdue. Richard Kessler said it loudly enough for every investor in the room to hear, then slid her badge and her 31-page safety report across the polished conference table so it landed, corner first, against her water glass. Take your hysterics somewhere else. We have a company to run. Maya Ellison did not raise her voice. She picked up the report, straightened the corner Kessler had bent, and said nothing at all. 41 days later, the Cardinal Falls Dam nearly failed, and every single person in that room finally understood exactly what her silence had been holding back. Before we go any further, if you believe the person calling the alarm is not the same as the person causing the danger, subscribe to this channel and stay with me until the end. Because this story does not end the way the men in that boardroom expected it to. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see exactly how far Maya's story travels. The Ridgeline Hydro boardroom occupied the top floor of a glass building in downtown Portland with a view on clear days all the way out to the gorge where the company's flagship asset, the Cardinal Falls Dam, held back 420 billion gallons of the Mackenzie River behind a concrete face that had been poured in 1962 and had not, in the 62 years since, undergone the kind of core structural review its own engineering team had been quietly recommending for the last 3 of them. Maya Ellison had been the one writing those recommendations. She had a doctorate in structural and geotechnical engineering from a program that trained maybe 40 dam safety specialists a year across the entire country, and she had spent 11 years at Ridgeline Hydro, rising, methodically and almost invisibly, from a junior inspection engineer to the company's senior dam safety officer, the person whose signature was legally required on every annual certification the company filed with the National Dam Safety Bureau, the quiet, unglamorous federal office that decided, on paper at least, whether a dam holding back a river above a town of 11,000 people was safe enough to keep operating for 1 more year. She had signed that certification honestly for 8 years running. This year, for the first time, she had refused. The report sitting on the table in front of Richard Kessler that morning was the reason. 31 pages, drafted over 6 weeks, built on 11 months of monitoring data she had collected herself on weekends after her regular inspection hours, because the budget for full-time monitoring had been quietly cut 2 years earlier to help fund the very expansion project Kessler was now presenting to a room full of investment bankers preparing Ridgeline Hydro for its initial public offering. The report said, in language Maya had chosen with extreme care because she had known exactly how it would land in a room like this one, that seepage readings at the dam's left abutment had increased 43% over the last 14 months, that 2 of the 6 spillway gates showed corrosion patterns consistent with structural fatigue rather than simple age, and that the company's proposed turbine expansion, which would increase the reservoir's normal operating pool by nearly 9 feet to generate the additional power output the IPO prospectus was built around, could not, in her professional judgment, be certified as safe without an independent structural review that would take, at minimum, 4 months, and would almost certainly require the reservoir to be drawn down during the review. An operational pause that would delay the IPO roadshow by an entire fiscal quarter. Richard Kessler had read the executive summary standing in his office 2 days earlier, and he had walked into this morning's investor preview meeting with the specific, controlled fury of a man who believed a woman 2 levels below him on an organizational chart had just tried to cost him $400 million out of simple, misguided caution. "You're fired, Dr. Ellison," he said again, quieter this time, which somehow landed harder than the first time, in front of 11 investment bankers from 3 different firms who had flown in from New York and San Francisco to watch a confident, well-run company present its growth story, and who were now watching something considerably more interesting instead. And frankly, it's overdue. Maya sat very still at the far end of the conference table, in the chair the company's assistant had assigned her that morning, 3 seats down from where she usually sat, a small, deliberate demotion she had noticed the moment she walked in and had said nothing about, because saying something about a chair she had learned over 11 years was never worth the breath. "Take your hysterics somewhere else," Kessler said. "We have a company to run." The word hysterics moved through the room the way a specific kind of word always did, landing differently on different faces. 2 of the investment bankers, both women, looked briefly, sharply at each other across the table, a look Maya recognized because she had given the same look to other women in other rooms her entire career. Warren Blackwell, Ridgeline's chief operating officer, seated at Kessler's right hand, did not look at Maya at all. He looked at his tablet, scrolling through nothing, the specific studied blankness of a man who agreed with what was happening and did not want his face to say so out loud. Maya picked up the report from where it had landed against her water glass. She straightened the corner Kessler had bent, the way she straightened everything, out of a precision that had less to do with tidiness than with the simple fact that sloppy things eventually failed. Whether they were reports, or dams, or careers, and she looked at Richard Kessler for exactly 2 seconds before she spoke. "The seepage data is in Appendix C," she said. "The corrosion photographs are in Appendix E. If you don't want to certify the expansion based on my findings, that's your decision to make as CEO. But I'd ask that you keep the monitoring program running at its current frequency, regardless of what happens to my employment this morning, because the dam doesn't know it's supposed to wait for a board decision before it tells you something's wrong." "Security will walk you out," Kessler said, not looking up. "Warren, get someone from facilities to collect her badge and her laptop. I want this handled before lunch." Maya stood. She gathered the report and her own laptop bag and the legal pad she had brought with 6 weeks of handwritten monitoring notes she had never digitized, precisely because she had, somewhere in the last 2 months, begun to suspect this exact morning was coming. And she walked the length of the conference table toward the door, past 11 investment bankers who were, she noted with the same cold observational precision she brought to a seepage reading, doing the math on what they had just watched considerably faster than Richard Kessler currently understood. She did not slam the door. She closed it quietly, the way she closed everything, and stood for a moment in the hallway outside the glass conference room, looking back through the glass wall at Kessler, already smiling again, already turning back to his slide deck. Already, she was certain, telling the room some version of the story where the alarmist engineer had simply gotten what she deserved. 41 days, Maya thought, standing alone in the hallway with a report under her arm that no longer had anywhere official to go. She did not yet know it would be exactly 41 days. She only knew, with the specific unglamorous certainty of an engineer who had spent 11 years reading a river's moods in numbers instead of feelings, that something underneath that dam was moving faster than the men who owned it were willing to believe, and that she had just been fired for being the only person in the building still paying attention to it. Maya Ellison had grown up 40 minutes downstream of a different dam entirely, a smaller one, in a town in eastern Washington, where her father had worked as a maintenance foreman for the regional irrigation district, and she had spent enough childhood afternoons standing beside him on spillway catwalks, listening to him explain the specific language of concrete and water, that by the time she left for college, she had already decided, with the quiet, stubborn certainty of a 14-year-old who had found the one subject that made sense to her, that she wanted to spend her life making sure structures like the ones her father maintained never became structures that failed. She had married once, briefly, in her late 20s, to a man named Dennis who had found her work interesting for exactly as long as it stayed abstract, a fascinating dinner party topic, and had found it considerably less interesting once it began requiring her to leave for 3-day inspection trips twice a month, and the marriage had ended, amicably enough, 6 years ago, in the specific quiet way marriages end when neither person did anything wrong except grow in a direction the other one hadn't planned for. She had no children. She had, instead, 11 years of monitoring logs, a small rented house 40 minutes from Cardinal Falls with a view of nothing in particular, and a professional reputation inside the small, specialized world of dam safety engineering that mattered a great deal more than it mattered inside a boardroom full of investment bankers who had never once had to explain to a river why it wasn't allowed to do what it wanted to do. She drove home from the boardroom in silence, and she did not cry, not because she was particularly proud of not crying, but because the part of her that would normally have processed a firing as a personal wound was, at that exact moment, entirely occupied processing something else, something that felt considerably more urgent than her own employment status. She had spent 11 months watching the seepage numbers at the left abutment climb in a pattern she recognized from exactly one other case in her career, a case study from graduate school, a dam in Idaho that had failed catastrophically in 1976. And the pattern in that case study, she now realized, sitting in her car in her own driveway with the engine off, had also included exactly the specific detail she had flagged in Appendix E, gate corrosion consistent with fatigue rather than age, appearing in the same construction season as a reservoir level increase nobody had adequately modeled. She sat in the driveway for 11 minutes before she went inside, And when she finally did, she did not check her phone for job listings. She opened her laptop, connected to the personal monitoring account she had, with what she now recognized as considerable foresight, set up 2 years earlier, using her own equipment and her own modest research budget, entirely separate from Ridgeline Hydro's official systems, specifically because she had learned over a career spent watching companies quietly defund the parts of engineering that didn't generate revenue, that data you didn't personally control was data you couldn't fully trust would still exist when you needed it. The seepage sensors she had installed herself on her own time. Over 18 months, using a small federal research grant she had applied for without telling Kessler, because she had correctly predicted he would have found a reason to say no. Were still transmitting. Ridgeline Hydro could fire her. It could not, without a physical trip to the dam site to locate and disable 4 small weatherproof units bolted into bedrock at the abutment, stop her from watching the numbers. She watched them for the rest of that first night, and the numbers had not improved. Her phone rang at 9 the next morning, an unfamiliar area code, and she almost let it go the way she had let 3 job-related calls go that morning already. But something made her pick it up, the same instinct she would think later that had made her install those sensors on her own time in the first place. "Dr. Ellison," a man's voice said. Older, measured, entirely unsurprised. The voice of someone who had made this exact kind of call more than once in a long career. "My name is Frank Delgado. I retired 18 months ago as Regional Director of the National Dam Safety Bureau. I think you and I should talk." Maya sat up straighter at her kitchen table. "I know who you are, Mr. Delgado. You wrote the standard for gate corrosion assessment I used in my report yesterday." "I know," Frank Delgado said, and she could hear faintly something that might have been a smile in his voice. "I got a call this morning from someone still inside the Bureau who happened to see a preliminary filing come through from Ridgeline Hydro's legal counsel, requesting an expedited review of an emergency operating certification, filed less than 18 hours after you were, I understand, removed from your position there. I found the timing interesting enough to make a few calls of my own. They're trying to certify without me," Maya said slowly, understanding arriving in the specific, cold, methodical way it always arrived for her. Piece by piece, each one clicking into the last. "They think if they can get someone else's signature on an emergency certification, they can move forward with the expansion without waiting for my structural review." "That appears to be exactly what they're trying to do," Frank Delgado said. "There's a problem with their plan, though, one I suspect you already know, and they either don't know or are choosing not to think about too carefully. Federal regulation requires the certifying engineer of record to have a minimum of 5 years of direct monitoring history with the specific facility being certified, precisely to prevent exactly this kind of maneuver, a company shopping for a friendlier signature after firing the engineer who actually understands the site. Do you know how many engineers currently meet that requirement for Cardinal Falls?" Maya closed her eyes. She already knew the answer before he finished asking the question, because she had, 11 years ago, been the one who inherited the role from the previous engineer of record. A woman who had retired, and there had been no one else qualified enough, or willing enough, to take the position since. "One," she said. "Just me. Just you," Frank Delgado agreed. Which means Ridgeline Hydro fired the only person legally capable of certifying their dam 4 days before an IPO roadshow that depends entirely on being able to tell investors the facility is fully compliant. And I would guess, though I can't prove it yet, that whoever handled your termination did not fully understand that consequence before they walked you out of the building. Maya sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift in her chest that was not quite triumph and not quite relief. Something colder and more useful than either. The specific focused calm she recognized from every real engineering problem she had ever solved. The moment the fog started to clear, and the actual shape of the thing became visible. "Mr. Delgado," she said, "why are you calling me?" "Because I spent 31 years at the Bureau watching good engineers get pushed out of rooms by men who understood balance sheets better than they understood concrete," Frank Delgado said. "And because I run a small independent consultancy now, 3 other retired Bureau engineers and myself doing exactly the kind of structural reviews companies like Ridgeline Hydro would prefer nobody ever conducted. I'd like to bring you in, formally, as lead structural investigator, effective today if you're willing. Not because I feel sorry for you, Dr. Ellison, because I read your report last night, in full, all 31 pages, and it's the most rigorous piece of dam safety analysis I've seen cross my desk in 4 years. And I don't have the luxury of letting talent like that sit unused while a company scrambles to find someone more agreeable to sign their paperwork." Maya looked out her kitchen window at the gray Oregon morning, at nothing in particular, and felt, for the first time since the conference room door had closed behind her, something that was almost like ground returning underneath her feet. "When do you need me to start?" she said, and it was not a question. She started that same afternoon in a small converted warehouse space in southeast Portland that Frank Delgado's consultancy used as an office, 3 desks, a wall of monitors, and a whiteboard covered in another engineer's handwriting, from a different project entirely, and by the end of her first day, she had transferred 18 months of her own independent sensor data onto the firm's secure servers and begun building, methodically, the same kind of structural model she had built for Ridgeline Hydro's internal report, except this time with nobody in the room whose bonus depended on the numbers coming out a particular way. Frank Delgado introduced her, on her second day, to the 2 other engineers at the firm, a quiet, precise woman named Odalis Ferrer, who specialized in seismic risk modeling, and a younger man named Tobias Kwan, who had spent 6 years doing spillway gate inspections before joining Delgado's team, and Maya found, within the first week, the specific unfamiliar pleasure of working alongside people whose first instinct, when she presented a finding, was to try to break it rather than to try to make it disappear. "Walk me through the corrosion pattern again," Odalis said on her 4th day. standing at the whiteboard with Maya's photographs from Appendix E pinned up in a row. You're saying this is fatigue, not simple oxidation. What's the actual mechanism you think is driving it? Cyclical load stress, Maya said, from the increased operating pool variance over the last 3 years. Ridgeline's been running the reservoir closer to maximum capacity more often, chasing peak power pricing, which means the gates are cycling through a wider pressure range more frequently than they were designed for in 1962. The metal's fatiguing the way a paper clip fatigues when you bend it back and forth, except this paper clip is holding back 420 billion gallons of water. Odalus studied the photographs for a long moment. "Show me the maintenance logs," she said. "If you're right, we should see accelerated wear starting almost exactly 3 years ago when the pricing strategy changed." They found it on Maya's 6th day at the firm, buried in 11 years of maintenance records Frank Delgado had requested and received, with what Maya suspected was considerable reluctance from Ridgeline Hydro's facilities department under a formal bureau document request that the company's lawyers had not been able to legally refuse. A gate inspection report from 3 years and 2 months earlier, filed by a junior technician, flagging exactly the wear pattern Maya had identified, recommending replacement within 18 months, and marked in a margin note from Warren Blackwell, "Deferred pending budget review, next cycle." They knew, Maya said quietly, standing in front of the whiteboard with the buried report pinned up next to her own photographs, 3 years apart, showing the same corrosion pattern at 2 different stages of the same slow failure. Not exactly what I know now, but they knew there was a problem, and they filed it away instead of fixing it, because fixing it would have cost money during exactly the years they were preparing this company to look as profitable as possible for an IPO. Frank Delgado looked at the 2 reports for a long time without speaking. "This is the kind of thing that ends up in front of a congressional subcommittee, Dr. Ellison," he said finally. "Not right away, but eventually. I need you to understand that the work you're doing here isn't just going to get you your job back or prove a point to Richard Kessler. It's going to end up mattering to a town of 11,000 people who have no idea any of this is happening underneath them." Maya thought about the town, Cardinal Falls itself, the small collection of houses, and a school and a hardware store sitting in the river valley 11 miles downstream of the dam, a town she had driven through hundreds of times on her way to and from inspections, had bought coffee in, had once, 6 years ago, helped a stranded motorist change a tire outside its single gas station, and she felt something settle into place in her chest, quiet and permanent, the specific weight of finally understanding exactly what her work had always actually been for. "I understand," she said. She built her case over the following 5 weeks with the same patient, methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, cross-referencing 18 months of her own sensor data against the buried maintenance report, against Odalus's seismic risk modeling, against a hydrological forecast. Tobias pulled from the National Weather Service, showing an unusually wet late-season storm pattern, building off the Pacific that was projected, with moderate confidence, to bring the heaviest rainfall the region had seen in 11 years to the Mackenzie River watershed sometime in the coming month. She had an ally inside Ridgeline Hydro she had not expected, a field engineer named Priya Nair, who had worked under Maya for 4 years, who called her quietly 11 days after the firing on a personal cell phone rather than a company line, and said, without much preamble, "I still have field access to the abutment sensors. I don't agree with what they did to you. Tell me what you need." "I need you to confirm the current gate 3 vibration readings against my baseline," Maya said. "Without telling anyone you're doing it." "Already have them," Priya said. "They're worse than your last data point. Whatever's happening down there, Maya, it isn't slowing down." By her 28th day at Frank Delgado's firm, Maya had assembled a complete structural case, 44 pages this time, considerably more rigorous than the report that had gotten her fired, cross-validated by 3 independent engineers with a combined 70 years of dam safety experience, and Frank Delgado filed it formally with the National Dam Safety Bureau as an independent third-party safety concern requesting an emergency inspection of Cardinal Falls Dam, a filing that triggered, under federal regulation, a mandatory response window of 30 days, a window that would close, Maya noted with the same cold, precise attention she brought to every calculation 4 days before Ridgeline Hydro's scheduled IPO roadshow event, an on-site investor showcase the company had planned with what Maya now understood as a particular, bitter irony, to be held at the dam itself on an observation platform built specifically for the occasion, overlooking the very spillway gates her report described as failing. She learned about the location of the roadshow event from Priya 11 days before it was scheduled to happen, and she sat with the information for a long time before she called Frank Delgado. "They're putting 400 investors and journalists on an observation platform at the base of a dam I've told them is showing fatigue failure in the gate system," she said. "During the wettest storm window this region has seen in over a decade." "They don't believe your report," Frank Delgado said. "Or they've decided the financial cost of believing it is higher than the cost of being wrong." "Which means someone needs to be there," Maya said, "with enough authority to stop it if the numbers say what I think they're going to say." There was a long pause on the line. "The Bureau's emergency inspection window closes the same week," Frank Delgado said slowly, and she could hear him thinking it through in real time, the way she thought through every real problem. "If I request an expedited site inspection, citing the imminent public safety exposure of an investor event at the facility during a documented high-risk weather window, I can have Bureau authority on site by the day of the roadshow. And Maya, given that you're the only engineer of record with 5 years of monitoring history at that facility, and given that your original certification refusal is the entire reason this inspection was triggered in the first place, I don't see any way the Bureau assigns anyone else to lead it." Maya looked out the warehouse window at a gray Portland sky that had, over the last several days, begun carrying the particular heavy, low quality of weather that was building toward something, and she felt the same cold, focused calm she had felt sitting in her kitchen the morning Frank Delgado first called her. "Then I need everything ready in 10 days, she said. Not 11. 10! Because I don't think the river is going to wait for the Bureau's paperwork any more than it waited for mine." The storm arrived 2 days early. Maya was reviewing the final draft of the Bureau's emergency inspection authorization, sitting at her desk in the warehouse office at 11 at night when Priya Nair called her for the second time that week, and this time there was no calm in her voice at all. "Gate 3's vibration readings just spiked," Priya said. "Not gradually. In the last 40 minutes. I'm looking at the live feed right now, and it's outside every parameter we've ever recorded. The rain's coming in faster than the forecast said it would, Maya. The reservoir's already up 6 feet since Tuesday, and it's still rising." Maya was on her feet before Priya finished the sentence, pulling up her own monitoring dashboard on the second screen, watching the seepage numbers at the left abutment do something she had spent 11 months modeling in theory and was now watching happen in real time, a curve bending upward faster than any of her projections had allowed for. "Get me the current pool elevation," she said, already reaching for her phone to call Frank Delgado. "And Priya, I need you to tell me honestly, is anyone at the facility tonight actively monitoring this, or is the system just logging it automatically with nobody watching?" There was a pause that told Maya everything before Priya said the words. "There's a night operator," Priya said. "He's not an engineer. He watches for alarms, not trends. Maya, the roadshow event is in 4 days. They've already got 200 RSVPs and a television crew booked for the observation platform. I don't think anyone in management is going to want to hear that the numbers look bad tonight." Frank Delgado answered on the first ring, the specific, alert, immediate answer of a man who had spent 31 years being woken up by exactly this kind of call. "Talk to me," he said. "The storm's ahead of schedule, and the Gate 3 readings just crossed the threshold I flagged in the report," Maya said, already pulling up a map of the watershed, already running the numbers in her head, even as she spoke them out loud. "At the current rate of pool rise, if the rain holds at forecast intensity for another 18 hours, we're looking at operating pool levels within 4 feet of the threshold where I project gate failure becomes a realistic possibility, not a theoretical one. Frank, the roadshow is in 4 days, and it's scheduled to happen directly downstream of Gate 3. On an observation platform, during what's now looking like the tail end of the same weather system that's about to push this reservoir into territory nobody at Ridgeline Hydro has ever operated it in. I'm calling the Bureau's regional duty officer right now," Frank Delgado said, and she could hear him already moving. A door opening, keys. "I'm invoking emergency inspection authority tonight, not next week. I want you on site at Cardinal Falls by 6 tomorrow morning, Maya, with full Bureau credentials, because as of this phone call, you are once again the only person in the state of Oregon with legal standing to tell that company what they're allowed to do with their own dam." Maya arrived at the Cardinal Falls facility at 5:52 the next morning in gray, driving rain, Wearing a bureau field jacket Frank Delgado had couriered to her apartment at 2 in the morning, carrying credentials that had been issued under emergency provision 6 hours earlier, and she stood in the facility's main gatehouse, badge in hand, facing a security guard named Dale, who had worked the morning shift at Cardinal Falls for 9 years and had walked her through that same gate 1,000 times before the day Kessler had her escorted out of it. "Good to see you, Doc," Dale said quietly, looking at the federal credentials without much surprise, the specific unsurprised look of a man who had also, apparently, been watching numbers he didn't like the shape of. "Mr. Blackwell's not going to be happy about this." "Mr. Blackwell doesn't get a vote anymore, Dale," Maya said, and walked through the gate. She spent the next 3 days living inside the dam's monitoring station with Priya Nair, Odalis Ferrer, and Tobias Kwan, running continuous structural assessments as the storm system stalled, unexpectedly, directly over the Mackenzie watershed instead of moving through it, dumping rain at a rate the region's meteorologists began describing by the second day as a 1 in 40-year event, and Maya watched the numbers she had projected 11 months ago stop being a model and start being a countdown. By the third night, Gate 3's fatigue indicators had crossed into a range that, in the case study from Idaho she had studied in graduate school, had preceded catastrophic failure by less than 72 hours. "We need to force a controlled drawdown," Maya said, standing in the monitoring station at 2 in the morning, the room lit by the cold glow of 11 separate screens. Odalis and Tobias both awake, both watching the same numbers she was. "Open the spillway gates that are still structurally sound. Release enough volume to bring the pool elevation down below the threshold before Gate 3's fatigue crosses into failure range." It's not a solution. It buys us time to do a controlled engineered repair instead of watching an uncontrolled one happen on its own. That requires operational authority over the facility, Odalis said, which currently belongs to Ridgeline Hydro, not to us. It requires the signature of the certifying engineer of record. Maya said, "In a declared emergency under the exact federal provision that exists specifically for situations like this one. And as of 6 o'clock 4 mornings ago, that's me again." She looked at the clock on the monitoring station wall. It was 2:14 in the morning. The roadshow, with its 400 investors and its television crew and its observation platform, built directly downstream of the gate she was watching fail in real time, was scheduled to begin in 31 hours. She called Richard Kessler at 6:00 that morning from the monitoring station with Frank Delgado on a second line and a bureau attorney patched in on a third, and she said, without any of the anger she had carried out of that boardroom 41 days earlier, in a voice that was calm and level and entirely without room for negotiation, "Mr. Kessler, this is Dr. Maya Ellison. As of this morning, I've been reinstated as certifying engineer of record for Cardinal Falls Dam under federal emergency provision, following a bureau inspection that confirms critical fatigue failure risk at Spillway Gate 3. I'm ordering an immediate controlled drawdown, and I'm formally advising you to cancel tomorrow's investor event, which is scheduled to place 400 people on an observation platform directly downstream of the gate in question. during active flood stage conditions. There was a long silence on the line, and then Richard Kessler's voice, tighter than she had ever heard it, stripped entirely of the smooth boardroom confidence from 41 days earlier. You don't have the authority to cancel a company event, Dr. Ellison. I don't need to cancel your event, Maya said. I need to tell you on the record with Bureau Counsel listening that if it proceeds as planned and Gate 3 fails during that event, the liability exposure for every person on that platform falls entirely on Ridgeline Hydro's board because you'll have received explicit written warning from the facility's certifying safety engineer 29 hours in advance and chosen to proceed anyway. What you do with that information is your decision. I'm simply making sure it's a fully informed one this time. The silence that followed lasted almost 11 seconds. Send me the drawdown authorization, Kessler said finally, his voice flat now, defeated in a way that had nothing to do with agreement and everything to do with arithmetic. And Dr. Ellison, the roadshow's canceled. I'll have Warren issue the statement. I'd recommend you also inform the town of Cardinal Falls, Maya said. 11,000 people live downstream of a gate I currently can't guarantee will hold for another 72 hours. They deserve considerably more warning than 400 investors were about to get. The controlled drawdown began at 7:40 that morning. 6 spillway gates opened in a carefully sequenced release Maya, Odalis, and Tobias had modeled overnight, designed to lower the reservoir's operating pool by 11 feet over 18 hours without sending a surge downstream large enough to flood the town itself, a balance that required, Maya would say later, the most precise real-time engineering work of her entire career, adjusting release rates every 40 minutes based on live seepage and vibration data from the abutment sensors she had installed herself on her own time 2 years before anyone else had believed they were necessary. Gate 3 held for the full 18 hours of the drawdown. It failed structurally 4 days later during a scheduled emergency shutdown for replacement, exactly as the engineering team had planned for it to fail. In a controlled environment, with no water behind it, with a repair crew standing ready. Instead of failing during flood stage in front of 400 investors and a television crew on an observation platform Maya had specifically warned would put every one of them directly in the path of the resulting surge. The story broke publicly 9 days later, not because Maya or Frank Delgado sought press attention, they hadn't, but because one of the television producers who had been scheduled to cover the canceled Investor Roadshow filed a records request with the National Dam Safety Bureau asking, simply, why the event had been called off with less than 30 hours' notice, and received, in response, a redacted but still unmistakably damning copy of Maya's emergency drawdown authorization, along with the buried maintenance report from 3 years earlier, showing Warren Blackwell's own handwritten note deferring a known gate replacement to protect the IPO timeline. The headline that ran across 3 major outlets within the week was not particularly subtle. Ridgeline Hydro fired the engineer who tried to stop this. A congressional subcommittee on infrastructure safety, exactly as Frank Delgado had predicted, opened a formal inquiry within the month, and Maya Ellison testified before it in person in a plain navy blazer with 11 months of her own independently collected data organized into a binder she had built herself on her own time, using equipment she had paid for out of a research grant Kessler had never known she'd applied for, and she answered every question the subcommittee asked her with the same calm, precise, unhurried thoroughness she had brought to every report she had ever written, refusing, even under pointed and occasionally hostile questioning from a congressman whose district office had received substantial campaign contributions from Ridgeline Hydro's parent investment group, to raise her voice a single time. Dr. Ellison, the congressman said midway through the hearing, in the particular tone of a man trying to suggest, without quite saying it outright, that a fired employee's testimony might carry some personal bias, isn't it true that you had a grievance against this company at the time you filed your report? I had a professional disagreement with the company's leadership about acceptable risk tolerance, Maya said. I filed my report 6 weeks before I was terminated, based entirely on structural monitoring data, none of which has changed in the weeks since. The company's decision to fire me for delivering that data doesn't change what the data says, Congressman. It only changes who was willing to keep collecting it afterward. The gallery, packed that day with residents who had driven up from Cardinal Falls itself, several of them people Maya recognized from the hardware store and the single gas station she had bought coffee in 100 times over 11 years, broke into applause that the chairman had to gavel down twice. Richard Kessler resigned as CEO of Ridgeline Hydro 11 weeks after the drawdown, in a statement that used the phrase stepping back to spend more time with family, a phrase Maya read on her phone standing in the Bureau's regional office, and found she genuinely could not summon much feeling about one way or another. The specific flat, quiet satisfaction of watching a consequence arrive that no longer required anything further from her to keep arriving on its own. Warren Blackwell was named 6 months later in a formal Bureau finding of negligence tied directly to the deferred maintenance memo, a finding that ended his career in dam operations entirely and became, in the small, specialized world of infrastructure safety, the kind of cautionary case study that got taught in graduate programs for the next decade. The way Maya herself had once studied the Idaho Dam failure from 1976. The National Dam Safety Bureau offered Maya the regional director position Frank Delgado had vacated 18 months earlier, the job he had, she realized, only after he mentioned it in passing one evening, been quietly grooming her for since the very first phone call, and she accepted it 4 months after the hearing, on the condition, which the Bureau granted without much argument given the political climate the hearing had created, that the office's monitoring budget for aging dams across the region would be doubled, funded specifically to make sure no engineer in her old position ever again had to install her own sensors on her own dime, because the official budget had been quietly redirected towards something more profitable. She kept working with Frank Delgado's small consultancy on the side for the first year, mostly out of loyalty, and partly, she admitted to herself only privately, because she had genuinely enjoyed The specific, uncomplicated pleasure of doing rigorous work alongside people who had never once asked her to make a number smaller to fit somebody else's timeline. Cardinal Falls Dam underwent a full structural rehabilitation over the following 18 months, funded after considerable and well-documented public pressure by Ridgeline Hydro's new leadership, a rehabilitation Maya oversaw personally in her new federal role, standing on the same catwalks she had once walked with her father, 40 minutes downstream of a different dam entirely, watching a repair crew replace the gate system she had spent 11 months modeling the failure of, feeling something settle into place in her chest that she recognized, eventually, as something closer to peace than to victory, the specific, quiet satisfaction of a problem correctly solved rather than simply won. There were harder days folded into those 18 months than the hearing transcripts or the news coverage ever fully captured. Days that mattered more to Maya than any headline because they were the days nobody else had been in the room for. There was the second night after the firing, before Frank Delgado's call had come, when she sat alone at her kitchen table with 18 months of her own data open on her laptop and genuinely wondered for the first time in her career whether she had been wrong, whether Kessler's word, hysterics, had somehow found its way underneath her own certainty the way water eventually found its way underneath even the most carefully poured concrete, and she made herself run the seepage model one more time, from scratch, checking every input, before she let herself believe it again, because she had learned a long time ago that the difference between a good engineer and a dangerous one was the willingness to doubt your own conclusions, exactly as hard as you doubted everyone else's. There was the morning, 3 weeks into the investigation, when she drove down to Cardinal Falls on a day off, not for work, and sat in the same gas station where she'd once helped a stranded motorist change a tire, and the woman behind the counter, who did not know yet who Maya was or what she'd spent 11 months trying to prevent, mentioned, making small talk, that her grandkids lived 2 streets from the river, and Maya had bought her coffee and driven home and sat in her car outside her own house for a long time, feeling the specific private weight of exactly what she was actually working to protect settle into her chest in a way that no boardroom conversation ever had. There was the call from her father, 81 now, retired from the irrigation district for over a decade, who had seen the initial news coverage before Maya had worked up the nerve to call him herself, and who said, when she finally did call, in a voice thick with something she hadn't heard from him since her mother's funeral, "I taught you to read that river the way I read the one back home. I always wondered if it would ever matter to anyone besides me that you knew how. I'm glad it did, Maya. I'm real glad it did." And there was the good, ordinary day, 11 months into the rehabilitation project, when Priya Nair, who had left Ridgeline Hydro entirely 6 months after the drawdown to join the Bureau's regional monitoring team under Maya's direction, found her on the same catwalk where Maya had once stood with her father and said, watching the repair crew below them fitting the new Gate 3 into place, "You know what I keep thinking about? If you hadn't installed those sensors yourself 2 years before anyone told you to, none of this happens the way it happened. Nobody catches it in time. I think about that too, Maya said. Most nights, if I'm honest. Why'd you do it? Priya asked. Spend your own money, your own weekends, on equipment the company should have paid for? Maya considered the question for a long moment, watching the crew below tighten the last of the gate's mounting bolts. 420 billion gallons of river held steady behind concrete that had, for the first time in over a decade, been fully and honestly accounted for. Because the dam doesn't care whose budget it's on, she said finally. It just tells you the truth, if you're patient enough to keep listening. I decided a long time ago I'd rather be the person who kept listening than the person who got comfortable not having to. 2 years after the hearing, Maya Ellison stood on the observation platform at Cardinal Falls. The same platform Ridgeline Hydro had once built for an investor roadshow that never happened, now repurposed, at her own recommendation, into a public safety education center, where school children from the town 11 miles downstream came twice a year to learn how the dam above their homes actually worked. And she watched a class of fourth graders lean over the railing, pointing at the new gate system, asking their teacher rapid, overlapping questions about how much water the reservoir could hold and what would happen if it ever got too full. Ask her, the teacher said, nodding toward Maya, standing a few feet away in her bureau field jacket. She's the engineer who takes care of it. A small girl in a yellow raincoat looked up at Maya with the particular fearless directness of an 8-year-old. Were you ever scared it was going to break? She asked. Maya crouched down slightly, so she was closer to the girl's height, the way her own father had once crouched down on a different catwalk, 40 minutes downstream of a different dam, explaining the language of concrete and water to a 14-year-old who hadn't yet decided what she wanted to spend her life doing. I was scared, Maya said honestly. But being scared wasn't the important part. The important part was that I kept watching the numbers anyway, every single day, even after some people told me I was worrying about nothing. That's the whole job, really. Not being fearless. Just being the person who keeps paying attention, especially on the days it would be easier not to. The girl considered this with the serious, weighing expression of a child deciding whether an answer was good enough to keep. That sounds like a hard job, she said finally. It is, Maya agreed. It's also the best one I've ever had. She stood on the platform for a while after the class filed back toward their bus, watching the river move steadily through the gates below, exactly as it was designed to, exactly as it had failed to for one terrifying stretch of 18 hours 2 years earlier. And she thought, the way she sometimes still did on quiet afternoons, about the woman who had sat in a boardroom chair, 3 seats down from where she usually sat, absorbing the word hysterics without flinching, straightening a bent corner of a report nobody in that room had wanted to read. She did not think of that woman with anger anymore. She thought of her, when she thought of her at all, with something closer to gratitude, the specific gratitude you owe an earlier version of yourself who kept collecting the data anyway, kept installing sensors on her own dime, kept believing the numbers over the noise. Even in the exact weeks when believing them cost her almost everything she had spent 11 years building. The quiet ones, Maya thought, watching the river move on beneath her, steady and patient and entirely indifferent to whoever happened to be in charge of listening to it that particular year, were never quiet because they had nothing urgent to say. They were quiet because they understood, better than anyone shouting across a boardroom table ever would, that the truth did not need volume to be true. It only needed someone patient enough to keep measuring it, carefully, faithfully, for as long as it took the rest of the world to finally catch up. She turned and walked back toward the gatehouse, the same one Dale still worked the morning shift at. 9 years, and counting now, and behind her, the river kept moving through the gates exactly as it was supposed to, held at last by a structure that finally told the truth about what it could and could not carry, and by an engineer who had never once, in 11 years, stopped listening for the difference.